This incident changed my life completely and definitely not for the better. Please like and subscribe to this channel to promote the video, thanks. 5 years ago, I, Alex, 28M, made a choice that completely changed my life, and not in a good way. Back then, I was riding high. I had just started a promising career at a design firm, focusing on architectural projects, and I loved every minute of it. I was also engaged to my girlfriend of 3 years, Sophia, 29F now, 24 then, who had been my rock through thick and thin. It felt like nothing could go wrong. Sophia and I had always been low-key. Neither of us wanted a big wedding, so we decided to elope to Charleston. The idea was simple: exchange vows by the water, with just close family around if they chose to come, and spend the rest of the time enjoying our honeymoon. Because the elopement itself wasn't going to break the bank, we decided to treat ourselves with bucket list adventures before the wedding. Sophia's dream was to go scuba diving at the Great Barrier Reef. She booked a trip with her best friend, Kate, and spent a week snorkeling and diving off the coast of Australia. My dream, on the other hand, was to visit Vietnam. I'd been fascinated with the country since college and always imagined exploring its lush landscapes, vibrant cities, and rich history. Sophia encouraged me to take the leap, reminding me that I'd been talking about Vietnam since the day we met. 6 months into our engagement, the time for my trip finally came. My best friend, Chris, and I packed our bags for 2 weeks in Southeast Asia. The first few days in Hanoi were a dream come true. We explored ancient temples, sampled incredible street food, and even took a day trip to Ha Long Bay. But things took a turn after a wild night out in the old quarter. Chris, true to form, got completely hammered despite my warnings to pace himself. The next morning, he was a wreck, completely unable to function. We had booked a guided motorbike tour through the mountains that day, something I'd been looking forward to for months. But Chris refused to get out of bed, groaning about his hangover. Frustrated, I decided to go solo. After grabbing a quick breakfast, I came across a man with a beat-up motorbike offering private tours. He was friendly, spoke decent English, and seemed eager to help me out. I ignored the warning bells in my head and agreed to go with him. At first, it was amazing. The ride took me through winding mountain roads and picturesque villages. I felt like I was in a dream. But as we ventured deeper into the countryside, I started to feel uneasy. The man took a turn off the main road and into dense forest. When I asked where we were going, he just smiled and assured me it was a shortcut. The next thing I knew, we were stopped in a remote clearing. While I was taking in the surroundings, a group of armed men appeared. They weren't police, and they didn't look friendly. My guide started speaking rapidly in a language I didn't understand, and I quickly realized something was very wrong. Within minutes, they were rifling through the man's motorbike. To my horror, they pulled out several packages of what I could only assume were drugs. My heart sank. I tried to explain that I was just a tourist and had nothing to do with it, but they weren't listening. They confiscated my belongings and loaded me and the guide into a truck. It wasn't until hours later that I realized we'd crossed into Laos. To make matters worse, my passport and ID were back at the hotel in Hanoi. I was stuck in a foreign country, accused of a crime I didn't commit, with no way to prove who I was. The local authorities were cold and dismissive, and I had no idea what was going to happen next. At first, I thought it would be okay. Jorge would realize I was gone and start searching for me. I clung to that hope like a lifeline during those first days. But as time crawled forward, it became clear, no one was coming. I was completely and utterly alone. The Cambodian jail was a waking nightmare. It wasn't just the filth, the overcrowding, or the lack of food, it was the oppressive, inescapable feeling that I'd been erased from the world. 5 months passed before I even saw a judge. When I finally got my day in court, there was no interpreter. My case was delayed another 5 months. I was trapped in limbo, not knowing if I'd ever see the outside world again. By the time I entered my plea at the pre-trial hearing, over a year had gone by. 14 more months passed before my actual trial. When it finally came, I dared to hope. The judge, after reviewing the evidence, dismissed the charges on time served. I could almost feel the sun on my face again. But before I could leave, the prosecutor appealed the dismissal. That decision slammed the door on my freedom for another 28 months. I stopped keeping track of time. What was the point? In those moments, I realized they must think I was dead. My parents, my fiancée Sophia, how could they not? Jorge didn't know where I'd gone. I'd left a voicemail for Sophia that morning about a jungle excursion, but after that, I disappeared. I imagined the panic, the unanswered questions. Then I imagined the memorial services, the slow acceptance that I was gone. And for a long time, I hated myself for causing them that pain. But some days, I hated them too. Why didn't anyone come? Why didn't anyone fight harder? It was irrational, I knew, but it kept me alive. I held on to the thought of Sophia's face, her laugh. I built a fantasy where she was out there, waiting for me, refusing to move on. After 52 months in captivity, I was released. I was a ghost in a foreign land, with nothing but the clothes on my back. The embassy still had my missing person file and helped me contact home. My first thought was Sophia, I needed to hear her voice. But when I called the number I'd memorized, a man answered. His voice was casual, unfamiliar. Sorry, I don't know anyone named Sophia. I hung up, feeling the ground shift beneath me. I called my mother next. Her voice cracked as soon as she realized it was me. I could hear her drop the phone, shouting for my father to come to the line. They were frantic, barely able to listen as I explained what had happened. I asked about Sophia repeatedly, but my mom kept brushing it aside. Alex, let's focus on getting you home. We'll talk about everything when you're here. I knew then. She'd moved on. The process of getting back to the US took weeks. My parents still had my original passport, which sped things up. They sent me money, and I stayed in a small hotel near the embassy. During those nights, I stared at the ceiling, replaying the years I'd lost. I thought of Sophia constantly, how much I wanted to see her, to tell her I was alive. But my parents were insistent. Wait, they said. Talk to us first. When I finally arrived home, I barely recognized myself in the reflection at the airport. I was thinner, harder, but more fragile in ways I couldn't name. My parents picked me up and drove me straight to their house. They wanted to ease me back into everything, but I couldn't wait. I needed answers. That night, we sat in the living room. My dad was silent, his hands folded tightly, while my mom handed me an envelope. It wasn't what I expected. Inside was a save-the-date card, elegant and simple. Sophia was smiling up at me, standing next to a man I didn't recognize. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and effortlessly charming. My chest tightened. She's engaged. I managed to choke out. My mother nodded, her face drawn. Alex, we thought you were gone. We had to move on. She had to move on. Tears blurred the card in my hand. Did you stay in touch with her? I asked, my voice trembling. Yes, my mom said quietly. She's been like family to us these last few years. The words hit me like a punch. How close are you? I asked, my tone sharp, bordering on desperate. My mom's face crumpled. Her father passed away last year. Your dad, he's going to walk her down the aisle. The air left the room. Why him? The question was out before I could stop it. My mother's voice cracked. Alex, we thought you were gone. We searched so long, so hard, but there was nothing. You don't know what it was like, the waiting, the wondering. We had a memorial service for you. Her voice broke completely. We had to let go. I couldn't hold back anymore. I don't care about the memorial. I don't care about any of that. What else aren't you telling me? My mother took a tablet from the table, her hands trembling slightly as she swiped through the photos. She handed it to me, and I stared at the screen, my heart sinking into my stomach. It was a group photo, my parents, Sophia, her fiancé, her mom, my brother, my sister, Jorge, and a handful of other friends. There were kids, too, scattered across the frame, laughing and carefree. But my eyes were drawn to the center. A little boy sat proudly behind a birthday cake. The decorations around him read, "Happy 4th birthday." His face glowed with happiness, his smile so big it seemed to light up the entire photo. And then I noticed the details, the way his nose crinkled slightly, the same way mine did at that age. His eyes, brown like Sophia's but with a spark I recognized as my own. I stared at my mother, unable to form the question, but she answered anyway. "That's your son," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "Paul Alex Ryan. We named him after you and your father." The world around me blurred. My son. My son. A child I didn't even know existed until that moment. I couldn't speak, couldn't think. Time felt like it stood still as I stared at his face, trying to reconcile the joy in the photo with the years I'd lost. Over the 2 weeks since I'd returned home, I had been overwhelmed by the deluge of information. Each day felt like an eternity and yet passed in a blur. My parents and siblings tried to catch me up on everything that had happened while I was gone. The gaps they filled in were painful, almost unbearable. When Jorge woke up that day 5 years ago and realized I hadn't returned from my excursion, he assumed I'd lost track of time. He tried calling me, but of course, I didn't answer. My phone had been confiscated immediately after my arrest. By nightfall, he started to worry. He reached out to my parents, asking if they'd heard from me. The next morning, my family was frantic, calling Jorge repeatedly, urging him to check the excursion operators. Jorge scoured the area for days, visiting every jungle tour operator he could find. Each one told him the same thing, they hadn't seen me. That's when he involved the local authorities. My parents, brother, and Sophia flew out shortly after, desperate to find me. Together, they canvassed the area for weeks, handing out flyers and pleading with anyone who would listen. But as the weeks turned into months, hope faded. No one had thought to search beyond Thailand's borders. Back home, Sophia was carrying a secret of her own. She discovered she was pregnant not long after I left. At the time, she was already 10 weeks along. I couldn't imagine the weight of it, the love of her life missing, presumed dead, while she carried our child. My parents told me she leaned on them heavily, and they stepped up without hesitation. They became her family in every sense of the word. My mom went with her to doctor's appointments, held her hand during ultrasounds, and was in the delivery room when Paul was born prematurely at 34 weeks. It had been touch and go at first, but he pulled through. My mother told me they clung to him like a lifeline, a piece of me they could hold on to while the rest of me remained lost. Paul gave us something to live for, my dad admitted. He saved us when we were drowning in grief. Losing you, it felt like the end of everything. I wanted to be angry, to lash out at someone, anyone. But I couldn't. It wasn't their fault. They had done what they could, and I had made the choice that led to my disappearance. Yet I couldn't stop the ache in my chest. They'd moved on in a way I couldn't yet fathom. While I was fighting for my survival, they were building a new life, a life I wasn't part of. Jorge visited me not long after I got home. He apologized over and over, his words tumbling out in a nervous rush. I should have done more, he kept saying. I should have known something was wrong. He looked like he was waiting for me to explode, but I couldn't summon the energy to yell at him. What was the point? Rationally, I knew it wasn't his fault, but a part of me still resented him. He got to go home, build a family, move on. I didn't. And then there was Sophia. My parents told me she was engaged to Kevin, a man who had stepped into her life when she needed stability the most. He'd been there for Paul's first words, first steps, every scraped knee and bedtime story. Paul called him Dad. My son didn't know me, and I didn't know how to change that without tearing apart the family Sophia had built. I haven't spoken to Sophia directly yet. My father told me about the day he went to see her and Kevin to share the news. He sat them down and explained that I had been found alive. Sophia had broken down completely, sobbing uncontrollably. At first, she thought he meant my body had been recovered. When he told her I was alive, her shock turned to something else, something heavier. "She's happy you're alive," my dad told me. "But she's scared, Nathan. Her life is different now. There's a lot to figure out." Figure out? The words churned in my stomach. I didn't know where I fit anymore. My parents arranged therapy for me, and I've been to one session, but I don't even know where to begin. 5 years of trauma and pain, of being beaten and starved and forgotten. 5 years of watching my world move on without me. How do you unpack that? How do you look at your son, your flesh and blood, and accept that he has another father? Right now, I feel like a ghost. I'm here, but I'm not. I see them, but they don't see me. I don't know how to come back from this. I don't know if I ever can. I tried texting Sophia the day after I got back. I spent an hour typing and deleting messages before finally settling on something simple. "Hey, Emily, it's Nathan. I know this is a lot, but I'd really like to talk." Her response came a full day later. "I'm so sorry. I just can't right now." That was it. Nothing else. No follow-up, no invitation to explain. I stared at my phone for a long time, trying to decide if I should text again, but eventually, I set it down. I didn't need to be told twice. She wasn't ready. No one volunteered much information about Kevin, and I didn't ask. All I knew was that they'd been engaged for a couple of months and planned to marry in 6. Everyone seemed to tiptoe around the subject like they were afraid to upset me, but their avoidance only made me more uneasy. The more I thought about it, the more I realized I didn't even know where I stood in any of this, not with Sophia, not with Paul, not with the family I'd once called my own. This past weekend, we were supposed to meet at the park. It was my first chance to meet Paul in person. My mother had been watching him more since I came back, but only at Alex and Kevin's house. I overheard her telling my dad they were easing him into it, showing him pictures of me and talking about me. He already knew I was his biological father, but I couldn't imagine what that meant to a 4-year-old. How could he reconcile the dad he knew with the stranger who had just reappeared? My parents and I arrived at the park first. The air felt heavy, like everyone was holding their breath. When Sophia's car pulled up, only Kevin and Paul stepped out. My heart sank. Sophia wasn't there. Paul ran straight to my dad and hugged him tightly. He spotted me next and froze. His small face wrinkled in confusion as he clung to my mom's leg, then shuffled back toward Kevin. I could see the apprehension in his little movements, and I didn't blame him. I was just as nervous. The others tried to nudge us toward an interaction, but I shook my head. "Let him play," I said softly. I didn't want to force it. Paul's face lit up at the mention of the playground, and he ran off to climb on the jungle gym. Kevin approached me, his expression careful but unreadable. "Hey," he said, sticking out his hand. I shook it. His grip was firm. Sophia couldn't come. She was getting ready, but she broke down. She said she wasn't ready to see you yet. I nodded, my throat dry. "I get it," I said. And I did. Of course, she wasn't ready. It was just hard to hear. I wandered over to the playground after a while, watching Paul as he pretended to be Spider-Man. When he saw me, he pointed and yelled, "You're Green Goblin. I'm gonna stop you." I laughed and played along, chasing him around as he shot imaginary webs at me. He was relentless, cackling as I pretended to be trapped in his webs. For a moment, everything else faded away, and it was just us. When we stopped for lunch, I noticed he ate his hot dog the same way I always had as a kid, ketchup on one side, mustard on the other, relish on top. I smiled, thinking maybe this wouldn't be so hard after all. Then, as he ran to the swings, I heard him call Kevin, Dad. The word hit me like a punch to the gut. I knew it was coming. I knew Kevin had been in his life for over 2 years, that he'd been there for all the moments I'd missed. But hearing it out loud hurt more than I could have imagined. My chest tightened, and I could feel the sting of tears building behind my eyes. I excused myself, muttering something about the bathroom, and hurried away. When I stepped out of the dingy park bathroom, Kevin was waiting for me. I stiffened immediately, unsure of what was coming. My parents were across the field, watching Paul play, but Kevin's presence felt too close. "Can we talk?" he asked. His voice wasn't confrontational, just firm. I hesitated but nodded. "Sure." He shifted his weight, his tone measured. "Look, I can't imagine what you've been through. I know this situation is messy. I just wanted to say I'm sorry for everything that's happened to you. It's not fair, and it's not right. But I also need to talk to you about Emily and Paul." I stayed quiet, letting him continue. "Sophia's struggling," he said, his expression softening. "I knew she would be when this day came. She's tried so hard to move forward, but you've always been a part of her. When we started dating, she wasn't ready. She cried after our first kiss because it wasn't you. It took a long time for her to accept that you weren't coming back." His words twisted in my chest. I didn't know how to respond, so I said nothing. "I love her," Kevin continued. "And I love Paul. I want what's best for them, and I think that includes you being part of Paul's life. But I need you to know that Sophia isn't in a good place right now. She's overwhelmed, and I don't want to see her spiral. I've set her up with a counselor, and I think it's important that she has time to figure out what she wants before you reach out to her. I'd appreciate it if you could give her that space." I swallowed hard. His words made sense, but they didn't make the knot in my chest any looser. "Yeah," I said finally. "I can do that." "Thank you," he said simply. He nodded once, then walked back toward Paul, who was climbing to the top of the slide. As I watched them together, I felt like a ghost, watching a life that could have been mine. But this was reality now, and I had to figure out where I fit in it. I stood there listening to Kevin, feeling my blood simmer. The guy had this calm, measured way of talking that made me feel like a storm in comparison. He wasn't wrong, he made good points, but it still grated on me. I wanted to punch him, not because of anything he said, but because he existed. Because he was the one Paul called Dad. Because he was in Emily's life. Because he was filling a role I had been ripped away from. But I bit it back. "Yeah, man. I can do that," I said tightly, then walked off to join my parents and Paul. I needed space, not whatever Kevin was trying to offer. Kevin disappeared into the park's gross bathroom, and I silently hoped it would at least smell bad enough to take some of the shine off him. When he came back, he announced he and Paul were heading out. Paul gave everyone a hug, including me. That small gesture surprised me in the best way, even if it felt tentative. Then, just as he turned to leave, he called out, "Bye, Rhino." I waved, but my heart twisted. As Paul grabbed Kevin's hand and skipped toward the car, I heard his small voice ask, "Dad, can we get a cookie cake on the way home?" Dad. Not me. Him. I was just Rhino. It hit harder than I thought it would, like a sharp ache behind my ribs. Over the next few weeks, Sophia and I started texting, but the messages felt hollow, like echoes bouncing off the surface of something much deeper. We couldn't seem to break through the walls we'd built around ourselves. Most conversations were short and polite, and any time they brushed against heavier topics, one of us would find an excuse to end it. It was frustrating, but I didn't know how to change it. The one thing keeping me afloat was spending more time with Paul. My mother started watching him at her house again, which gave us a chance to get to know each other. One day, I even took him out for ice cream, just the two of us. He picked Superman flavor, of course, because what other choice would a superhero make? I couldn't help but smile at how easily he adapted to everything. He was resilient in a way I envied. He still called me Rhino, but I held on to the hope that one day, he'd call me something else. Last week, Kevin stopped by to pick up Paul, and before he left, he asked if we could talk. My guard shot up immediately. What now? I thought. But I nodded anyway. Look, this might sound weird, he started, but my brother owns a construction company and is looking for an estimator. I told him you used to be an architect, and he said he'd give you an interview if you're interested. I stared at him, confused. Why are you telling me this? I asked, more curtly than I intended. It's not a job offer or anything, Kevin said quickly. Just a lead. I thought it might help. He handed me a business card, and I took it reluctantly. It was such a decent thing to do. And that pissed me off. How was I supposed to hate someone who kept going out of his way to be nice? Thanks, I muttered, pocketing the card. Kevin nodded and left with Paul, and I was left standing there, torn between gratitude and resentment. On Friday, Sophia and I finally agreed to meet for lunch. I suggested the Italian place that had been ours, thinking it might bring some comfort, but her reaction surprised me. She was upset, almost offended. I thought she was going to cancel altogether, but after a tense pause, we pivoted to Applebee's. When she walked in, I froze. She looked as beautiful as the last time I saw her, maybe more. Time hadn't diminished her, it had refined her. When we hugged, a shiver ran through me, and for a second, I didn't want to let go. I lingered just a little too long before pulling away. I hoped she didn't notice, but I think she did. We started with small talk through the appetizer, but once the food arrived, the conversation shifted. She opened up about those first few months after I disappeared. It was like being buried alive, she said softly. I was grieving and pregnant, and I didn't know how to keep going most days. Her words cut through me. She described how she couldn't stand to be in our apartment alone and spent most nights at her parents' house or with mine. Every time the phone rang, her stomach dropped. At first, she hoped it would be news about me. But as time went on, she began to fear it. I thought they'd call to tell me they found your body, she said, her voice trembling. She talked about how much my family had supported her. My mother had gone to every doctor's appointment with her, held her hand during ultrasounds, and been in the delivery room when Paul was born prematurely. Your mom was incredible, she said. I don't know what I would have done without her. It was after Paul's first birthday that my parents sat her down. They told me I was young, she said quietly. That I deserved to live again, even if you weren't coming back. At first, she resisted. She couldn't bring herself to leave Paul with anyone, terrified something might happen to him. If you could disappear in an instant, then so could he, she said. But eventually, she realized she was suffocating herself and started taking small steps to reconnect with the world. Listening to her was like peeling back a layer of skin and exposing every raw nerve. I wanted to tell her how sorry I was for everything she went through, but no words seemed enough. The weight of what we'd lost hung in the air between us, unspoken but heavy. When lunch ended, we hugged again, and this time, it was harder to let go. As I watched her walk away, I realized how much of her life I'd missed and how much I still didn't know. Sophia told me how it happened, how she met Kevin. It was at a Starbucks 2 months after she started trying to piece her life back together. She had Paul balanced on her hip, fumbling with her bag to find her phone. She was frazzled, probably running on caffeine and little else. That's when Kevin stepped in. He scanned his phone to pay for her coffee and muffin, flashing her an easy smile. He wasn't pushy, just confident. While they waited for her order, he struck up a conversation, asking about Paul and making her laugh for what must have been the first time in months. When her name was called, he grabbed her bag and handed it to her along with his business card. "No pressure," he'd said. "But I'd like to get to know you." She called him the next day. 4 months later, he met Paul. A year after that, they moved in with him, and just a few months ago, they got engaged. She didn't elaborate much beyond that, but I could hear the undercurrent in her voice. Kevin had been there for her in ways I couldn't be. I hated that thought even as I knew it wasn't her fault, or his. I couldn't hold back anymore. "Sophia, I need to say this. I still love you. I've loved you every day I was gone, and coming back to see you with someone else." My voice cracked, but I kept going. "It's been impossible. The idea of getting back to you is what kept me alive, Sophia. It's why I fought to survive. Is there any chance, any at all, that we could try again? That you'd consider giving us another shot?" Even as I said it, I hated myself for putting her in that position. I knew it was selfish, but I had to ask. I couldn't live with myself if I didn't. Her eyes filled with tears, and she shook her head. "Alex, I love you. I never stopped. But I love Kevin too. And I'm marrying him." It felt like my chest caved in, but she wasn't finished. "It's not fair to you, I know that. You didn't do anything wrong. But I had to move on. I thought you were gone forever. For years, I grieved you. I cried until I couldn't anymore. And then Kevin, he showed me that I could be happy again. That it was okay to start living." She wiped her tears away and looked at me with so much guilt it was unbearable. "When you came back, I was so happy, Nathan. I really was. But I also felt so guilty. Guilty that I moved on. Guilty that I let myself love someone else." I reached for her hand. "Sophia, you don't have anything to feel guilty about. I made the decision to go on that trip. I put myself in that position. You had no way of knowing I'd ever come back. Of course, you moved on. How could you not?" Her fingers tightened around mine. "But I hurt you," she whispered. "You didn't," I said firmly. "I dreamed of coming back to you, of course I did. But I knew it was unrealistic. You were right to do what you did. I'm just sorry for putting you in this position now." She looked down at her coffee, her lip trembling. "Thank you for saying that. I've been dreading this conversation." We sat in silence after that, the weight of our words pressing down on us. It felt like the room itself was holding its breath. Finally, she broke the stillness. "How do you want to handle things with Paul?" she asked. My voice softened. "I want to be in his life. I already love him, Sophia." Her face lit up with relief. "I'm so happy to hear that. I always told him about you. I didn't want him to ever think he was abandoned." I nodded, my chest tightening. "He's the one bright spot in all of this. The one thing I don't regret." She hesitated before telling me that Kevin had planned to adopt Paul once they got married, but now that I was back, that wouldn't happen. "You're on the birth certificate," she assured me. "But if you want to double-check the legal side of things, I completely understand." We made plans to meet again later in the week. All of us, me, her, Kevin, and Paul. The idea was to ease Paul into the idea of having all of us there together. She also encouraged me to keep doing one-on-one activities with him. "He really likes you, Nathan," she said with a soft smile. "He just needs a little time." When we hugged goodbye, it felt heavy, like closing a book I wasn't ready to put down. I watched her walk away, her shoulders slightly hunched, and knew in my heart that this was it. There was no going back. When I got back to my parents' house, I broke down. All the hope I'd held on to during those years in prison shattered in that moment. Sophia was gone, not because she wanted to hurt me, but because life had moved on without me. I'd spent so much time imagining the life we'd rebuild together, and now I was faced with the reality that I wasn't part of her future. But as the tears dried, something shifted. I couldn't let this be the end of my story. I couldn't keep living in the shadow of what I'd lost. If I couldn't have the life I dreamed of, I needed to create something new. The next morning, I swallowed my pride and called Kevin's brother. He offered me an interview that same afternoon. By the end of the day, I had a job as an estimator at his construction company. It wasn't architecture, but it was a step forward. For the first time in years, I felt like I was walking towards something instead of being stuck in place. This was the start of something new. Not the life I planned, but the one I still had. And that was enough, for now. You're not going to believe what's happened over the past 6 months. It's been nothing short of insane, but in a good way, mostly. After that first face-to-face with Sophia, I decided I needed to move forward with my life. I couldn't keep living in the shadows of what could have been. Kevin's brother, Kyle, 36M, hired me as an estimator at his construction company, and at first, I threw myself into the work just to stay distracted. About 2 months in, Kyle started noticing my architectural background. He'd have me draft designs for some of his custom builds and then compare them to the work of the architect he usually hired. To my surprise, and honestly, to his, he liked my designs better. It didn't take long before I transitioned into solely designing custom homes for Kyle while still helping with estimating. He gave me a massive raise, which finally allowed me to move out of my parents' house and into my own apartment. For the first time since I got back, I started to feel like I had a direction. Meanwhile, Sophia and Kevin's wedding plans continued to move forward, but there was one big change. My father, who was originally supposed to walk her down the aisle, stepped aside. Everyone agreed that given my return, it just didn't feel right. Instead, her much older brother, he's 16 years older than her, as Sophia was a bit of an oops baby, took on the role. After our first lunch, Sophia and I started seeing each other more often. We made a point to meet with Paul at least once a week. Kevin usually joined us, though he and Sophia kept their couple moments to a minimum out of respect. At first, it felt a little awkward, but over time, it became fun. I found myself looking forward to those outings, not just to spend time with Paul but also to reconnect with Sophia. It reminded me of the early days of our relationship, when everything felt easy and exciting. Then back-to-school season hit, and Kevin's business exploded. Apparently, the screen printing industry goes wild in the fall with orders for sports teams, clubs, and college events. Kevin was swamped, and suddenly, it was just Emily, Paul, and me spending time together. During those months, Sophia and I grew closer. At first, our hugs were casual, the kind you'd give an old friend. But as time went on, they lingered. Our conversations deepened, venturing into topics we hadn't touched in years. It felt like peeling back layers of the past, rediscovering each other piece by piece. Eventually, Kevin started joining us again, but Sophia and I didn't stop rebuilding our friendship. The dynamic shifted, but not enough to stop what was already happening. And then something incredible happened. Paul started calling me Dad. The first time he did it, I thought I misheard him. When it sunk in, I teared up. It happened again and again, and every time, it hit me just as hard. Life went on. As the wedding approached, I made the decision not to attend. My parents planned to go as guests, but I knew it would be too much for me. The thought of watching Emily marry someone else, even someone as decent as Kevin, was unbearable. The weekend before the wedding, they had their bachelor and bachelorette parties. The plan was for each group to have dinner and an activity before meeting up at a bar or club later. I wasn't involved, of course, and I had no idea where they'd end up. Still, that night, I couldn't bring myself to stay home. I needed to get out, even if it was just to sit at a bar and wallow with a drink in hand. Around 10:30, I was nursing a buzz and scrolling through my phone when I saw Sophia and her bachelorette crew walk into the bar. My stomach flipped. I wanted to slip into the crowd and avoid her altogether, but before I could, she spotted me. She came over, her face lighting up as she saw me. We started talking, the conversation easy and playful, with just a hint of something more. A song she loved came on, and she grabbed my hand, pulling me onto the dance floor. We laughed as we danced, and for a moment, it felt like nothing else existed but us. When the song ended, she stumbled slightly, and I caught her. Her hands rested on my chest as she looked up at me, and our faces moved closer. For a second, I thought we were going to kiss. But then she pulled back, laughing nervously. "We shouldn't," she said softly. We moved to the bar to get another drink, trying to shake off the moment. It was probably a good thing we didn't kiss because, not 2 minutes later, Kevin walked in. He greeted Sophia with a kiss, and just like that, I became the third wheel. The energy between us shifted, and I decided it was time to call it a night. I ordered an Uber and left, my mind spinning with everything that had just happened. The ride home was a blur. I couldn't stop replaying the moment we almost kissed, the way she'd looked at me, the hesitation in her voice. It was like the universe was dangling something in front of me only to snatch it away. As much as I tried to push it down, I couldn't ignore what had happened, or what it meant. When I got home, I sat in the quiet of my apartment, staring at the walls. I knew I couldn't stay in this limbo forever. Emily was marrying Kevin, and that wasn't going to change. I needed to accept it, no matter how much it hurt. The next morning, I decided it was time to focus on myself. I threw myself into my work, determined to prove to Kyle that he'd made the right choice in hiring me. Slowly but surely, I started to rebuild, not the life I'd lost, but something new. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was moving forward. The next day, I woke up with a dull headache, the remnants of a late night and too many drinks. The sunlight spilling through the blinds didn't help, and I groaned, burying my head under a pillow. It was Sunday, my self-declared day of laziness. I had no plans, no obligations, just the familiar silence of my apartment. That silence shattered when I heard someone rattling my front door handle. I froze, my heart pounding. The handle jiggled again, and then came the knocking, loud, insistent. I stumbled out of bed, throwing on a shirt, and hurried to the door. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it maintenance? A neighbor? Or worse, something else? I swung the door open, and there she was. Sophia. Before I could process anything, she stepped forward, wrapped her arms around me, and kissed me. It wasn't a hesitant kiss, it was the kind of kiss that could shatter walls, the kind that stole the breath right out of your lungs. I felt my heart stumble, caught somewhere between confusion and overwhelming joy. When she pulled back, her eyes glistened. "I'm sorry for just showing up like this," she said, her voice trembling. I didn't know where else to go. I blinked, trying to steady myself. "Sophia, what's going on?" She hesitated, biting her lip, then took a deep breath. "This morning, Kevin and I had a talk. He started asking questions I couldn't answer without being honest about how I feel. I told him the truth, Nathan. I told him I still have feelings for you." My breath caught in my throat. "And, what did he say?" Tears slipped down her cheeks as she continued. "He said he already knew. That it hurt, but he couldn't ignore it anymore. He told me we both deserve to be happy, and he stepped away. It's over. I called your parents, and they're keeping Paul for a bit longer so I could talk to you. I love you, Alex. I always have. And if you feel the same," she trailed off, her eyes searching mine. I didn't hesitate. "Sophia, I've never stopped loving you. This is all I've ever wanted." She let out a shaky laugh, relief flooding her face. Then let's not waste any more time. She had 2 bags packed, one for herself, one for Paul, and by the end of the day, she'd moved in. It felt surreal, like I was walking through a dream I was afraid to wake from. The next day, my father went to see Kevin. He didn't tell me until afterward, probably knowing I'd have tried to stop him. Kevin deserved to hear it from me, he said. He's been a part of our lives, and I couldn't just pretend like none of this happened. He described Kevin as composed, though visibly drained. They talked over coffee, my father trying to offer some semblance of comfort. "What are you going to do now?" my dad had asked. Kevin shrugged. "No idea. I'll try to get deposits back where I can, I guess. Beyond that, I'll figure it out." It was then my father offered to take over the wedding arrangements, every reservation, every deposit. He didn't press Kevin for details, didn't need to. "I think he knew why," my dad said quietly. Meanwhile, I had to face Kyle. Walking into work that morning felt like stepping into a storm I knew I couldn't avoid. As soon as I arrived, Kyle called me into his office. "Close the door," he said, his tone clipped. I sat across from him, my stomach twisting into knots. He leaned forward, his fingers interlocked on the desk. "Let me be clear, I'm angry. My brother tells me to let it go, and I will, but right now, I'm pissed. And honestly, I'm not sure I'll ever completely forgive you for this." I opened my mouth to respond, but he held up a hand, cutting me off. "That said, I'm not going to sink to revenge. My brother and I learned that lesson years ago. But I think it's best we part ways. My family needs time to heal, and you staying here, it doesn't help." My heart sank, but I nodded, bracing for the worst. Kyle continued. "I'm not leaving you out in the cold, though. You've got 1 week of paid leave. During that time, I want you to call Lee. He runs a construction company and is a good friend of mine. He's agreed to hire you at your current salary. It's commercial work, but you'll be fine." I tried to thank him, but his expression hardened. "This isn't for you," he snapped. "It's for Kevin. Now pack your things and go." That afternoon, I called Lee. He was gracious, offering me an interview the next day. By the end of it, I had a new job lined up to start in 2 weeks. It wasn't ideal, but it was a fresh start, and that's all I needed. When my father came home and told me he'd taken over the wedding arrangements, Sophia and I exchanged a look. It was unspoken but clear, we both knew what we wanted. It wasn't the beach wedding we'd once dreamed of, but it didn't matter. What mattered was that we were together. The ceremony was simple but beautiful. Jorge stood by my side as my best man, grinning ear to ear. Sophia looked breathtaking in her dress, more radiant than I'd ever seen her. Finding a tux on short notice was a headache, but it worked out in the end. We were surrounded by the people who had been there for us through it all, and for the first time in years, everything felt right. It's been a month since the wedding, and I still wake up in disbelief. Every time I look at Sophia, every time Paul calls me Dad, I'm reminded of how far I've come, from a prison cell in Cambodia to a life I thought I'd lost forever. Paul's had a bit of trouble adjusting. He misses Kevin, which is understandable, but he's resilient. Lately, he's seemed happier, and that gives me hope. Life isn't perfect, but it's ours. And for the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be.